Well, thanks, Jill, and thanks, everybody. This is an honor to be here at the Ikes meeting. I'm actually a card-carrying member of the Minnesota Valley chapter, and recently became a member, but I, for a long time, was friends with Dwight Alt, who was a farmer and a member of the Land Stewardship Project, and was in the Austin chapter, and he was a big influence on me. Unfortunately, we lost him last year, but so this is I feel like he's kind of here in spirit. So I'm Brian DeVore, and I'm an editor and communications coordinator for the Land Stewardship Project, which is, if you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit sustainable ag organization based here in Minnesota, but we work throughout the upper Midwest. And I also recently authored a book by the University of Wisconsin Press called Wildly Successful Farming, Sustainability, and the New Agricultural Land Ethic. And it's kind of tells the stories of some of these farmers who I call ecological agrarians, these people who kind of refuse to separate the ecological from the agronomic on their farms, and are doing various things to kind of create this wildly successful model that we call it, this kind of idea of mimicking nature as much as possible and kind of getting to that sweet spot that Steve had talked about, where you are getting economic benefits but also ecological benefits. And I'll just put a plug in for the book. There are copies for sale back here for $25, and I think you guys are raffling off Gabe Brown's book, Dirt to Soil. So read my book first, but then read Gabe's book, because it's actually his is a really good book. Also, also back on the back table, these are free. This is a publication the Land Stewardship Project came out with last year called Soil Health, Water, and Climate Change. And it's really we work primarily with farmers, but this is really written for non-farmers or a lay audience. And it's just a real quick primer on the ways that we can build soil health, and that we can, as we say, kind of address two of the big environmental issues we're struggling with right now, which is water quality and climate change. And it's also available. We have this paper version, but it's also available on our website, landstewardshipproject.org, as an app. So I just wanted to put in a plug for that. We've got a lot of good response to that, and we're just trying to get that message out to a general audience, this idea of building soil health and soil carbon, as Steve had talked about, type of thing. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to give an example of this approach, this kind of ecosystems approach to watershed health, one example that the Land Stewardship Project worked on and that I also wrote about in the book. And then I'm going to go a little bit deeper into soil health, because I think that that can be a real key to all of this on the land right now, more in the immediate future. So I just wanted to dedicate this presentation to Dan Specht. He's the guy in the front of the picture here. He's fishing with Jeff Kling on the Mississippi River down near McGregor, Iowa. And he was one of the first farmers I ran into some 25 years ago who really helped me make that connection to what was going on the landscape and what was going on in our watersheds. And Dan was interesting. He farmed near McGregor. Unfortunately, we lost him in a haying accident a few years ago, tragically. But he was he had a real interest in ecosystems approach to farming and to also protecting his watershed. And he had actually made visits to the Gulf of Mexico and seen what was going on with the dead zone down there. And I remember I was writing an article about the dead zone. I was trying to kind of put a human face on it, and I went to meet with Dan, and he said, well, you know, I'll talk to you and I'll take you around and show you some of the things I'm doing on my farm, but then we have to go fishing that night. And I thought, well, that's a waste of time. What's the connection there? Well, I realized this was part of his education. He was like, there's a connection between what I'm doing on my land here and what I'm doing down on the river. So he really had a big influence on me and a lot of folks. And one of the other reasons he was so into water quality and was able to make those connections, he lived very close to Big Spring, which is the biggest spring in Iowa. And it has been studied for decades, looking at nitrogen contamination in that kind of karst geology area there. So he was really knew that area and knew what was going on underneath the ground as well as on the surface. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that the Land Stewardship Project was involved with called the Chippewa 10% Project. This is in western Minnesota, and the Chippewa it's a 1.3 million acre watershed, and it's the single biggest watershed tributary to the Minnesota River, which we know has a lot of problems. This is a photo I took a few years ago near the headwaters of the Chippewa. And one of the things that we were doing, we worked with the Chippewa River Watershed Project and some other groups in that area, and we were trying to figure out, it's heavily agricultural, and we were trying to figure out how we can get water quality improvements in a way that would still allow working farmland, something that's providing economic benefits in the area and keeping people on the land, but also get those benefits, a little bit of what Steve was talking about. And there had been some research done that if we were to target things like perennial cover on the land, more continuous living cover we call it, which is using annual cover crops to fill in those gaps and keep that land covered between the cash crop growing seasons, on 10% of the land, not all of the land, but 10%, and this would be in a targeted area, we could get those benefits. And one of the things that kind of really spawned this is there's an agronomist at Iowa State University who's doing a lot of interesting work on agroecology named Matt Liebman, and he talks a lot about this idea that we often pay for practices rather than outcomes. It's clear that random acts of conservation are a waste of time. He's pretty blunt about it, but what he's saying is often we farm programs, farm conservation programs and subsidy programs that are connected to conservation really are providing these kind of benefits, but they're not really measuring the outcomes, and they're not targeted very well. They're not really looking at, well, where can we get the most bang for the buck? And that is so important, you know, as budgets get cut and we're really trying to we're seeing some watersheds really suffer, and it's because of particular spots in those watersheds that are having a lot of problems with runoff, that type of thing. So I'm just going to share, I'm not really a numbers person, but I'm just going to share a couple of things, and it's this whole idea, like I said, of if we could get 10% of that land in certain practices or certain land use practices, that we could really see these benefits. And what we were looking at, kind of the gauge was, it was state restrictions or state guidelines for water quality, you know, fishable, swimmable, that type of thing. One of the key things that has became clear is we got to go beyond this 110-day growing season, this kind of roughly 110-day growing season that we have for corn and beans. If you look at satellite images of a state like Minnesota, you know, you get this nice green cover starting in about late May, June, or whatever, and going into the fall, and then after that, the land is bare and brown, and you can drive right now as the snow is melting, you can see the results of that. That is a whole lot of solar energy going to waste. And I guess the other thing I'd like to really emphasize is it's not just what's going on the surface, there are no living roots in there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the importance of this living root system. So I'm just going to tell a little bit of a story, and this is kind of what I do in the book, is tell some of give these examples through stories of some of these farmers that we've worked with over the years. So this guy on the right that's kind of bent down looking, that's Dan Ginigas. He's a beef and crop farmer in Pope County in west central Minnesota, and he is an example of, we had approached farmers and non-farming landowners and groups like the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the DNR, and other groups, and said, okay, you guys have not always gotten along. There's been a lot of contention in this area about land use, but what is an area that you can agree on? Where is something that we can maybe start a discussion on? And through community meetings and that type of thing, and surveys and just kind of one-to-one conversations at kitchen tables, we came to the conclusion that one thing everybody wanted to see more of on the landscape out in that area was grass or some kind of perennial vegetation. And they may have wanted it for different reasons. The farmers wanted it because people like Dan, who's a grazer, he's very, his operation is very grazing focused and intensive. He wanted it for forage, for, you know, a low-cost feed source for his cattle and sheep. The wildlife agencies and the Nature Conservancy, you know, the more environmental community, they wanted it for wildlife habitat and to improve water quality. Well, that's enough of an area to kind of come together and figure out a way that we can kind of hit that sweet spot where we're going to get those benefits. So we started working with trying to come up with both introducing some of these ideas of how to get more continuous living cover, as I call it, on there. And when I talk about continuous living cover, it can be in the form of pasture grass, but it can also be in the form of, like I said, these cover crops that you grow between the cash crop growing season. So you have cover on the land and living roots in the soil 365 days a year. And there has been just incredible research in recent years showing the benefits of that, of building that soil organic carbon, and it helps you manage that water. Of course, it helps you sequester greenhouse gases. It reduces the demand that you have for certain inputs, such as chemicals, which can be a runoff problem. It cuts erosion. There's all these benefits. What we were trying to do was show that you not only get those kind of environmental benefits, but there are these economic benefits that the farmers who are utilizing these systems can get benefits, and everything from they're not spending as much money on fertilizer. They're able to break up pest cycles without being so reliant on expensive herbicides, to, again, that cheap source of forage for their livestock kind of thing. So one of the other kind of major players in this were scientists like Steve Chaplin, who really liked this idea of utilizing what some of these farmers were doing as far as a service for improving the habitat on their landscapes. And so the Nature Conservancy, for example, has land out there, and some of that land was getting invaded with invasive species. And they were looking for ways to control that. So people like Dan Jenigas, they were able to invite them onto their land and do managed rotational grazing, kind of this conservation grazing system to control those species. And so the farmer would get the benefit of taking pressure off their own pastures, and the Nature Conservancy, or in other cases the Fish and Wildlife Service, because they were also allowing some rotational grazing on their land, they were able to get the benefits of controlling invasive species, and maybe in kind of a wider scale, and this is what Steve's quote here kind of gets at, is that they were able to get that kind of benefits of the habitat, you know, pollinator habitat, more perennial cover out there, grassland songbird habitat, spread beyond just those private and public boundaries. They were able to do that across the community kind of thing. And so people would start to see the benefits of that. One of the picture I'd had before of the, I guess it was back here, of Dan here. This is something called a BioBlitz, which was very much, it was a way to bring the community in and to, I guess, get people to, I don't know if you're familiar with the BioBlitz, but it's like this 24-hour scavenger hunt where you kind of, you keep track of how many, you bring in naturalists and they lead groups, and they try to tabulate how many birds, how many animals, how many insects, all types of things are going on there, and then you can compare it later. And this was land that had been grazed on Nature Conservancy land. We wanted to see, so then if we do a BioBlitz in the future, well, what is the impact on those species? But it's also a way for the community to address kind of what's going on. And I guess another important player in that was, there was another group that we worked with a lot with, clean up our river environment, the river environment, CURE, because they were really interested in, well, what is, they work a lot on the Minnesota River, and they're trying to figure out, well, what is going to be that long-term impact of seeing a lot of these ecosystem services on there. So I'm just going to switch. So the result is, with the Chippewa 10%, we were able to get, I don't have the exact figures, but we were able to get several thousand acres, I guess, under certain land use practices, everything from more managed rotational grazing, cover cropping, more no-till systems, and more diverse rotations of crops. I think one of the things that was the most successful probably was this idea where we had farmers who were raising cash crops, and maybe they had some livestock, and they were able to get cover crops planted in between those growing seasons, and then get economic value immediately out of those cover crops by grazing them. Because that's one of the setbacks for cover cropping, and it's why it hasn't gotten as popular as we would like to see it, is for the typical farmer, if they don't have livestock, they're not seeing an immediate economic return on planting cover crops. I mean, the other issue is we have a very narrow planting window here in this upper Midwest for getting those in, but there are some ways of working around that, as we've seen in some other states. But really, where cover crops have taken off is where a farmer has cattle or other livestock that can graze that and add some economic value to it in the off season. Where we have seen some other situations that are very positive is even if a farmer does not have livestock, maybe they're able to borrow their neighbor's livestock and create some networks that way. But what that requires is, in your community, you have to have livestock that are not just put up in big CAFOs and separated from the land. You have to have them out on the land, kind of thing. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about soil health, because that was a very important part of this project, and I think it's one of the most exciting areas we have right now as far as using kind of this ecological approach to improving water quality and watershed health while benefiting farmers economically. And I love this quote from Aldo Leopold. The most important characteristic of an organism is that capacity for internal self-renewal known as health. And there has been, in case you haven't been aware of this, there has been a huge, huge interest in the past, I would say, decade in soil health. And the Natural Resources Conservation Service has really been a leader on this nationally, and we're seeing a ton of interest on the part of what I would call conventional farmers in using soil health to make their operations, I guess, more sustainable economically, but also ecologically. And I guess one of the things that this is kind of going against, and one of the, I guess, the powers that we're pushing against, or the ideas that we're pushing against when we talk about soil health and treating it as an ecosystem. I mean, it is the most diverse ecosystem in the world, the soil biome. But is this idea that was really based on Justus von Liebig, who was a 19th century, I don't know, I think he invented organic chemistry. That was kind of his claim to fame. But he really pushed this idea that we did not need to work on feeding the soil and improving the soil. That was just a stand for the plants, and we needed to focus on really feeding those plants and applying fertilizer directly to them, and then everything would be okay. Well, it worked for a while. It worked very well, but we're running up against the limitations of that system. And I'll lay out some of these examples. And these are just some pictures of, you know, how part of the issue, part of the challenge that we have is soil often shows us when it's not feeling well, and we see, you know, severe erosion like this. But then sometimes it doesn't show us. It hides it. And this is a picture that I took in central Iowa. This is a no-till soybean field in central Iowa. And there was a research project that Iowa State was doing down there where they were measuring erosion using these flumes. I'd gone there on a hot summer day, and there was some very cranky graduate students who had just dug out that flume because they kept having to dig it out. And the farmer whose field this was, who was farming this, Gary Van Rieswick, he was a pioneer in no-till agriculture. And he was shocked at how much soil he was losing. You don't see, because it's kind of covered, you see a little bit of a runoff there, but really, if you were just to drive by that field, you wouldn't think there was that much erosion. So it really was an eye-opener for him. And the thing that I think is maybe really helped push this soil health revolution is farmers like Gary, who were pioneers in no-till, which is a very cutting-edge conservation measure, and it has saved untold amounts of soil over the years, is starting to run up to its limits because the soil that it is based on, the soil that we're all relying on, is starting to show signs of being very biologically dead. And it's a combination of compaction of that soil, that the no-till system is very reliant on chemicals, which is not helping the soil biome, but it's also climate change. It's a system that worked very well when we weren't seeing these severe rainstorms. So where we've seen the most interest on the part of farmers doing no-till or doing kind of these soil health practices is farmers who do no-till. They're very interested in soil conservation, and now they're trying to figure out a way to keep that no-till system and keep it sustainable in the long term by building that soil health and building that soil biology. So this is Jay Fear. He's there was a lot of leadership in this area on the part of the NRCS. He's an NRCS soil health expert in Burleigh County, North Dakota. We were talking about Gabe Brown. That's where he's from. And this is kind of one of the areas where this really got off the ground. And I really like this quote from Jay. We had accepted a degraded resource. And so Jay had done his job as a good public servant over the years. He had helped farmers put in grassed waterways, terraces, all these practices. And because of these other factors that I pointed out about the soil becoming more kind of biologically impoverished, they were seeing erosion on land they shouldn't be seeing it on. Plus the farmers were going broke. They were putting on more and more inputs, and their yields were leveling off or going down, and we're seeing a lot of issues. They were not able to manage their water well and all of that. So I had the opportunity a few years ago to go out to Burleigh County and see this kind of soil health team that they had created involving Jay and some other folks that were kind of involved in the soil conservation movement there, but most importantly, farmers. Fortunately for them, the USDA has a research station, the Mandan Research Station, so they had one of the nation's leading soil microbiologists, Kristen Nichols, who was there, and she was able to help them kind of do the science into this. And they came up with a very integrated approach where they were using a combination of no-till, cover cropping, mob grazing of livestock, diverse rotations of crops to build their soil health. And I think one of the most exciting aspects of that story, and it's one of the reasons that this kind of spawned similar teams around the country, is that they were able to show that soil organic matter can be built in a matter of years. And now when I took soil science at Iowa State University, and I will admit I got a C in it, but I did take it and I passed it, we were told you could not build soil organic matter on a farm in a typical lifetime. Well, these farmers were able to show that you can. You can build that soil organic matter. And just, if you're not familiar, soil organic matter is really what the soil world revolves around. It's that living part of the soil. It's less than 5% of it, but it drives 95% of the functions. And it does everything from sequester carbon to manage water to create fertility. I mean, it does it all. And so when they discovered that farmers could build that soil organic matter, that was huge. It gave those farmers control of what they were doing, and as Jay said, we no longer had to accept soil as a degraded resource, that we could improve it. We didn't just have to accept a status quo or see it go down. So these are just some of the benefits of kind of building that soil health. And we've lost, depending on what area you're in, we've lost 30% to 75% of our carbon. And when I talk about carbon, that's that soil organic carbon kind of thing. When you improve organic matter by 1%, you can store 25,000 gallons. That's, and there's, talking about the economics, there's been some good research out of Indiana showing what is that stored water capacity worth in the middle of August when you haven't had rain for several weeks. It's worth several bushels of corn, and that's money in the bank. So we're starting to see more of that, so those good connections that way. And just talking about nitrogen runoff, so cover cropping, which is a key aspect of building soil health, can reduce nitrogen by 20 to 30%. There was a study done in Iowa where they were using diversified crop rotations, cover cropping, some grazing of cover crops, and they were able to reduce the herbicide-related toxicity by 200 times. And that was because they weren't as reliant on herbicides. They were breaking up those pest cycles and able to build that soil health ability to be self-resilient. And again, going back to this, it's always dangerous to put definite numbers on this, but what we're seeing here in Minnesota in this climate is farmers that we're working with is about 3 to 10 years, depending on what system they're using, they can see their organic matter going up. So just to kind of put things in perspective, I think the tall grass prairie, it was double digits organic matter levels. The typical corn and soybean field right now in Minnesota would be maybe 2%, and something like that, maybe less, unfortunately. We're seeing farms, we have some farms we're working with in southeast Minnesota now who have doubled that to about 4%. It's not what the tall grass prairie was, but that when you can double it and you can see these benefits, it's huge. So this is Gabe Brown, who I had referenced before about his book, and he really talks about this idea of seeing it as an investment. He was willing to put up with many years of just kind of getting by barely economically, but he really saw this as building his soil health by that he was going, that in the future he wouldn't be using as many chemicals, he wouldn't be spending as much money on inputs, that he would be creating soil that was more self-reliant and self-resilient. Here he is. I took this picture. I stood on top of his truck and took this picture. And now Gabe's so famous, I would never, he spent a half a day with me. He was very generous with his time. This would never happen today, so I feel pretty fortunate. He was standing in a 12-way mix of cover crops that he had planted. And so that's another key point that came out of this research and now has been spread to other parts of the country when they look at things like cover cropping. When I was there, so many farmers like Gabe Brown would talk about this idea that they were trying to mimic nature and trying to mimic that tall grass prairie system. Now, they're never going to get to the diversity that you would see in a tall grass prairie, but this whole idea of diversity, having diversity creates this resiliency is really really a new concept for agriculture, because we've been so reliant on monocrops and that you don't want anything to compete with them. But some of these ideas where they were able to plant very diverse mixes of cover crops came out of actually research that's been done here in Minnesota by David Tillman and some folks on how much benefit you get from a diverse grassland ecosystem. And what they find is maybe you aren't going to get top yields, say in grain or whatever, by having a very diverse mix in here. Say, for example, he was trying to get sorghum off of this. He's not going to get the top yields, but they are going to be kind of working, they kind of work together in a way, and they were finding that some of these very diverse mixes, these 12A mixes, were much more drought tolerant than when they were just using a couple species or even one species. And what they found was they don't really when things get tough, when the weather gets tough, they kind of work together and they kind of create this biomass production that's really off the wall. And part of that is, what they're finding more and more is, there's a lot going on underneath the ground with the mycorrhizal fungi and the soil biome, where these roots are interacting in ways that we are just barely starting to understand. They kind of discovered it by accident because actually Gabe started this 12-way mix because he had a bunch of cover crop seeds sitting in his warehouse that he was trying to get rid of. So, you know, sometimes accidents can happen. I will point out that one of the reasons that were able to kind of mess around and experiment with stuff, land is much cheaper in North Dakota than it is here. So that is one benefit that they had. But the other benefit was, like I said, the USDA Mandan Research Station was there, and he was able to drag people like Kristen Nichols out and say, what is going on here? I need to know why I'm building organic matter when all the textbooks say I can't. And she was able to verify that. So it was a really good team approach. So when we talk about building soil health, it's not just about that runoff. It's about that infiltration. How much water are we getting to go down into the system and be stored for later use? And, you know, that's so particularly is very important when we look at nitrogen, which tends to go down through the soil profile and get into our tile lines. And anytime we can, you know, it helps, and this again helps the farmer so that they can get into the fields, so they can get the crop harvested. I mean, we've seen the past couple of planting and harvest seasons we've had so many issues with that water pooling on top of the ground and not allowing farmers to get in. We're starting to see situations where farmers are putting in tiles between tiles because they cannot get that water off of there quick enough. And we are seeing situations now with, particularly with cover cropping, where I really like this term, using roots. And when I talk about some of the cover crops that are common here, it would be like cereal rye, brassicas, this tillage radish, things like that. We're seeing situations where they're sending roots down through that hard pan and breaking up the compaction, and they call it biodrilling. I really like that term. And one farmer I talked to, I had an opportunity a couple years ago to go to Indiana, where on average, in a given year, about 30% of their land is cover cropped. Here in Minnesota, it would be more like 2%. And one of the reasons they've been so successful there is because that was the leader in no-till agriculture several years ago. They were really the pioneers in it. And so they started to see some of the limitations of no-till earlier than others. So they really were panicked, and they really wanted to improve it through cover cropping and building soil health. But one of the stories I like about that is there's a big corn and soybean farmer out there named Dan DeSutter, who was he was doing no-till corn and beans on several thousand acres, and Purdue University had talked him into putting in like an acre of cover crop. And he was out in the field one day digging out a tile line, and he noticed how it was cereal rye in this case, had gone through that hard pan and broken it up. I mean, I've heard of soil trench tests, you know, where they'll dig a soil trench, and they'll see actually corn roots hit that hard pan and take a 90-degree turn because it can't get through it. But these roots were penetrating that, biodrilling down through that. So he's a numbers guy. He used to be an investment banker, and he kind of crunched the numbers, and he figured out how much oil or fuel he was burning and how much wear and tear on his equipment to do deep digging to break up his hard pan, compared it to the cost of the cover crop seed, and said, hey, there's no comparison. It's much cheaper for me to plant cover crops. So that kind of won him on that. Oops. This is just an example. This was out of North Dakota. They have a lot of field days where they try to really show farmers the benefits of building that soil health. And this was it's not a very good photo, but it's a really good example. They took a pan and they did a rain, like a sampling of this. This would be an inch of rainfall that's falling on this piece of land. Then they flipped it over. So you can't really tell. I think maybe this much is wet. It's powder dry. And as Jay Fear said, you've made a drought. I mean, that's why we get so many situations where we'll get a lot of rain, and it seems like a week later we're in a drought situation again. It's just the soil is not able to make use of it. This is just a chart that the Union of Concerned Scientists has developed, showing, and the numbers on the side are the number of experiments that were done to show this, but showing some of the different, what I would call these soil health friendly practices.
how much water infiltration they can allow. This one that I'm a little bit vexed by, I'm not sure, is this cropland grazing. I'm not sure. So cropland grazing, I assume they were grazing cover crops, and I'm not sure why that one doesn't come out so well on infiltration. So I'm curious to look into that more. But you can see some of the, grazing management, this rotational grazing. Of course, not having any grazing, but I would argue that land needs some kind of disturbance. You're going to have to build that biology somehow. And so completely excluding grazing, I'm not sure. But then the perennials, of course, are very good. Cover crops. And then this is where, you see no-till. It's good, but I think what some of those experiments are probably looking at is no-till systems that have been in place for years and years and years without building that soil biology. So then you start to see a little bit of eking backward on infiltration. So this is a really interesting project that was done down in Iowa and by Iowa State and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Ag. And what they did, and it's kind of interesting, it's this 10% figure comes up again. They looked at what if we planted 10% of a corn or soybean field in tallgrass prairie. Not just a grassed waterway with brome grass or whatever, but a tallgrass prairie. And restoring a prairie system. And they put them in, again, it was very targeted. They used some real sophisticated research to look at, well, what part of that field is most vulnerable to runoff? And they would place these strips or kind of chunks of tallgrass prairie in there. They figured they would get good reductions in runoff because as opposed to the typical what's planted in a grassed waterway or whatever, which is brome grass or whatever, these tallgrass prairie species, it's different thicknesses of stems, and they got very deep roots, and it can kind of create this pinball effect where it dissipates the energy of the water and helps that infiltration. They were a little bit shocked at how much of a reduction they got. So the one that really struck me is this is soil export, the 95% less soil export. That's a fancy word of saying 95% less soil erosion. 84% less nitrogen, 90% less phosphorus. And that has been so successful. I was just at a conference in Iowa last week where Iowa State has an extensionist whose sole job is to go around the state and help farmers set up these prairie strips on their farms. And right now they're trying to figure out, and Steve had talked a little bit about this, providing incentives, how they can jibe that in with programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, some of these government conservation programs. Because, it's just 10%. Well, 10% in a corn soybean field is still a lot that you're taking out of production. So again, it's an example of we need to, we're probably as a society going to have to pay those farmers to put in that tallgrass prairie. I have seen a couple examples where farmers have gotten them established, and once they got them established, we're able to rotationally graze those prairie strips and get some economic value out of them. But in general, your typical corn soybean farmer is gonna, 10% is 10%. But it's another example of we don't have to plant the entire landscape in tallgrass prairie. We can get these conservation benefits. I would also just like to point out that this research was prompted by no-till farmers like Gary Van Rieswick in central Iowa who were running up against problems with their no-till system, starting to see erosion where it shouldn't be. So where I've seen these strips work the best is in a system where you have no-till, you're using cover crops in that no-till system, but then you have these prairie strips to kind of polish off that whole conservation there. So there's 5 principles of soil health that a lot of these farmers are talking about is soil armor, minimize soil disturbance, plant diversity, continuous living plants and roots, livestock integration. I want to really emphasize number 4, this idea of getting roots in there year round. People are starting to talk about maybe we shouldn't call them cover crops anymore because that gets people to focus too much on what's happening on the surface. We really need to be looking at what's going on underneath and with these roots. And it's really like trying to drink water out of a fire hose to keep up with all the new research in soil health. We're just really learning something new literally every month. There's a new paper or new examples coming out. And what I like about it is a lot of that research was prompted by what farmers were observing on their own land that they shouldn't have been able to accomplish that they were. So this is just, again, this idea of, just going to go through these real quickly, is just this idea, what some of these principles look like on the land. So this is a cover crop field. This is in North Dakota, where they, again, we're using an 8 to 10 to 12 species mix. This guy was then coming in and grazing. He has a big beef operation. He was grazing it. The other advantage that they have a little bit in North Dakota is they still have small grains as part of their rotation, and that really opens up some windows for getting in cover crops. I'd like to see small grains make a real comeback here in Minnesota. Armor the Soil. This is on Tom Cotter's farm down near Austin, actually, and he's hosted a lot of soil health field days with Land Stewardship Project, and it just really shows the benefits of getting that cover on there. And then Living Roots. This is a growth of it's brassicas in southeast Minnesota in October. You can get quite a bit of growth if you can get some heat units there in October, and farmers are often able to get out there and graze that for a month, and a month of grazing saves you buying hay, saves you on feed costs that you normally would be spending money on buying that feed. So it's a very important economic piece. And then integrate livestock, and again that idea of getting livestock out on the land and integrating them either through grazing the cover crops, grazing the pastures, adding economic value. And we've had so many advances in rotational grazing systems. The fencing systems, the watering systems are really come a long ways. I'm just going to go, when we talk about ecosystems, I think an important ecosystem we need to look at is kind of the human/business kind of community ecosystem. And I talked about Indiana and how they've had so much success getting cover crops. Part of the reason is when they created their soil health teams, a very important member of that team were co-ops, seed dealers, implement dealers, local welding shops, because they needed somebody who could modify some of this equipment to put in the cover crops, to do interseeding of cover crops. And one of the things they've done is they've modified these high boy sprayers to put in cover crops, which is great because then you can go in when the corn, like in August when the corn is, getting close to maturity, but you can put in that cover crop, harvest that corn, and by that time the cover crop's slowly gotten started, but then once you remove that corn cover, it really takes off and you can get a lot of growth there in the fall. And so that was, I think, a very important, and it's in a very important way that we're going to see this maybe take off in areas like this, is if we can bring in the business community, and they'll see an economic value to this. The co-ops in Indiana, they have their people that they hire to spread fertilizer. Well, they found that they often had dead periods during the year when they weren't busy. Well, if they could get them to use similar equipment to spread cover crops, it's a way to keep those people busy. Oh, sorry. I'll buzz through this. So this is just an example of how in Indiana they really were able to make that connection between economics and soil health. And so this is just no-till, but because they were able to build their organic matter, well, they had organic matter, they did get some organic matter, and the NPK value, that's where farmers are going to pay attention, is the fertilizer value, $46. But then here, no-till, and then they, 8 years ago, had started using cover crops, were able to increase their organic matter about 1%, and then their NPK value is $151. So that's key. This is another example. This is the Breitkreitz farm down in Redwood County. They're using a combination of cover cropping, mob grazing, diverse rotations, and to build their soil health. I don't know what their organic matter levels are. I think they're getting up to that 4%, 5% level. Total net gain, $190 an acre. This is Ray Weil, who's an ecologist. He just talks about this idea, and this is the other thing that I think is really an incentive for farmers. It's kind of making farming fun for them again. They're kind of learning things about their soil that they didn't know, and it's kind of fun for them. And Ray Weil, he's kind of really helped promote that. He works a lot in Indiana, places like that. This is Jennifer and Mike Ruprecht in southeast Minnesota, and Kristen Nichols talks about how farmers like them. This is a slake test where you take your soil and you put it in these little cages, and then you add water. And so this far to the left is their rotationally grazed cover crop land, and that soil is staying together. And then as you go more into the conventional tillage, see how it falls apart. I mean, that's a huge that soil's ability to again kind of stay together. I heard a term recently called vertical erosion, where it's not just runoff, but that soil kind of blows up almost when you kind of don't get that soil compaction or soil water infiltration that you need. This is Jim Wolf in west central Minnesota in Pope County, and he is using an innovative system where he has 30-inch corn rows, but then every once in a while he has a 60-inch row, and that allows him then to put in a cover crop because he has more sunlight. And what he's found is his production on that corn ground is the same. He doesn't suffer yields because he still has the same seed population, but because he's able to have these gaps in there, he's able to build fertility and still get the yields that he wants. And then he'll go in and harvest that. After he harvests that, and he'll graze that. This is just a roller crimper. That's a new system that they're using. It's this way of you roll down your cover crop, and then you can plant soybeans right into it, and it creates this mulch. And it's a way that organic farmers, because one of the knocks against organics is it does rely on tillage, and that kind of can do a number on your soil health. But this is a way to do chemical-free no-till, where you're using that living mulch to kind of control your weeds. And this is down in southeast Minnesota, down near Rochester. A farmer was using this. Just this, again, talking about almost all these ideas that we've used, mechanics or chemicals, we're finding a lot of them can be fixed with biology. And I just wanted to end with this is Jay Fear and Kristen Nichols out in North Dakota. And what I like about this whole idea of soil health, focusing on soil ecosystems, is this idea that we can take it further, that we don't have to accept, again, a degraded resource, that if we have high expectations or don't limit the expectations, we can really, really push it. And it's this idea of the farmers pushing the scientists and the scientists pushing the farmers. And this is our climate guide thing that I pointed out. So that's it. Sorry I went over time. Thank you.